The hail sounded like gunshots against the farmhouse roof, and Elsie Perkins knew, with the certainty that comes from 60 years of Kansas storms, that something sacred had finally broken. The morning after the storm, Elsie stood in her kitchen, staring at the brown water stain spreading across the ceiling like spilled coffee on white linen. The hail had been merciless, golf ball-sized ice that shattered her tomato plants and left dents in the aluminum siding that would never come out. But it was the crack in the attic floor that made her stomach turn. Water had seeped through, creating a dark line that pointed directly to the door she hadn't opened in 23 years. Her bare feet moved across the cold linoleum, each step echoing in the empty house that felt too big for one woman and too small for all her memories. The ladder to the attic creaked under her weight. 60 years of carrying wheat buckets and hauling feed sacks had left her sturdy, but the arthritis in her knees reminded her that time was winning the war against her body. The attic smelled of mothballs and disappointment. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light streaming through the damaged roof, and there, in the corner where she'd left it decades ago, sat the old cedar chest her mother had brought from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. The lock had rusted away, leaving only a ghostly outline on the wood. Inside, beneath layers of hand-stitched quilts that smelled of lavender and lost dreams, her fingers found something that made her heart skip. A leather journal, brown and worn, with Margaret Perkins, 1962, written in her mother's careful script across the cover. Elsie had never known her mother to keep a diary. Margaret had been a woman of few words and fewer secrets, or so Elsie had always believed. The pages felt fragile between her fingers, like dried leaves that might crumble at the slightest touch. The first entry was dated 3 months before Elsie's birth. Henry came by the field again today. I pretended not to see him, but my heart nearly burst through my ribs. Tomorrow I marry Thomas, and this foolish love will have to die with the sunset. Elsie's hands trembled as she read, the words blurring through tears she hadn't expected. Her father Thomas had been a good man, quiet, steady, reliable as spring rain. But her mother had always carried a sadness that no amount of harvest celebrations or Christmas mornings could touch. Now, sitting in the dusty attic with hail damage dripping around her, Elsie finally understood why. A crash from the yard below made her jump, the journal tumbling from her lap. Through the small attic window, she could see a large oak tree had lost a massive branch in the storm. And there, struggling in the grass beneath the fallen limb, was a great horned owl, its left wing bent at an unnatural angle, eyes wide with pain and confusion. Elsie had always believed that some things were meant to stay buried. But as she watched the wounded creature try desperately to fly, she realized that sometimes the storm comes not to destroy, but to reveal what's been waiting in the dark all along. The owl didn't fight her when she approached with the old horse blanket draped over her arms. It simply watched with those enormous amber eyes, as if recognizing another creature that had learned to endure pain in silence. Elsie had delivered calves and set broken fence posts, but there was something different about this. The way the bird's chest rose and fell with labored breathing, the way it tilted its head when she spoke in the soft voice she used to reserve for colicky foals. "Easy now," she whispered, wrapping the blanket around the owl's body while avoiding the talons that could shred her weathered hands. "We're both too old to pretend we don't need help." Inside the house, she cleared off the kitchen table and made a nest from clean dish towels. The owl's wing hung at a sickening angle, but the bone didn't appear to be broken through the skin. She remembered her father setting a hawk's wing when she was 12, using strips of cardboard and medical tape to create a splint that held until the wild thing was ready to fly again. The nearest veterinarian was 40 miles away in Junction City, and Dr. Morrison would charge more than her monthly grocery budget to look at a wild bird. Elsie had learned long ago that in places like this, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away and help came slowly if it came at all, you learned to heal what you could with what you had. She found the medical supplies in the bathroom cabinet. Bandages left over from her husband's diabetes care, adhesive tape, and a bottle of iodine that had turned the color of rust. The owl remained still as she worked, only flinching when she touched the damaged wing. Its trust felt like a gift she didn't deserve. While the bird rested, Elsie returned to her mother's journal. The entries painted a picture of a woman torn between duty and desire, trapped by the expectations of a time when women didn't have the luxury of choosing love over security. Margaret had written about lying awake at night, listening to Thomas's steady breathing and thinking about Henry's hands, calloused from years of working his family's corn farm on the other side of the Smoky Hill River. "I saw Henry at the grain elevator today," read one entry from 1963. "He didn't speak, but he tipped his hat the way he always did. Thomas was loading feed in the truck and didn't notice. I wanted to run to Henry, to tell him that I think about him every morning when I hang the laundry and every evening when I set the table for 2 instead of 3. But what good would it do? Some bridges burn themselves, and you can't uncross a river that's already gone dry." The words hit Elsie like a physical blow. Her own marriage to Robert had ended 15 years ago, not because of another man, but because of the slow erosion that comes from two people who care for each other but never quite learn to love in the same language. Robert had wanted a social life, dinner parties and bridge clubs and vacations to places with room service. Elsie had wanted to stay on the land, to tend the garden her mother had planted and preserve the apple trees that had weathered every drought since the 1930s. She'd chosen the farm over the marriage, just as her mother had chosen duty over love. The parallel felt too sharp to be coincidence. A soft sound from the kitchen reminded her of her patient. The owl had managed to turn its head completely around, an unnerving sight that would have startled most people, but Elsie found it oddly comforting. The bird was alert, aware, fighting. That was more than she could say for herself most days. Outside, the sun was setting behind the wheat fields, painting the sky the color of the peaches her mother used to can every August. Somewhere out there, on a farm she hadn't visited in decades, Henry might still be watching the same sunset, wondering about the woman who had chosen stability over the wild, uncertain flight of the heart. The owl ate the strips of raw chicken Elsie offered, delicately taking each piece from her fingers as if they were sharing a formal meal. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the bird's wing was healing in the makeshift splint she'd fashioned from old cardboard and medical tape. But it was the creature's eyes that haunted her, ancient and knowing, as if it could see straight through her skin to the loneliness she'd been carrying like stones in her pockets. She'd read every page of her mother's journal twice now, the leather cover worn smooth from her constant handling. The final entry was dated just 6 months before Margaret's death from cancer. Elsie came by today with news of her divorce. She tried to pretend it didn't hurt, but I could see the pain in the way she held her shoulders, like she was bracing for another blow. I wanted to tell her about Henry, about the choice I made and how it shaped everything that came after. But what kind of mother burdens her daughter with regrets? Some secrets should die with the people who carry them. Maybe that's the only kindness I have left to give. The irony wasn't lost on Elsie. Her mother had spent 40 years protecting her from the truth of a love sacrificed for duty, while Elsie had spent the last 15 years protecting herself from the possibility of love at all. After Robert left, she'd turned down every invitation to church socials and community potlucks, convinced that a divorced woman with calloused hands and dirt under her fingernails had nothing to offer anyone. She found herself standing in front of the oval mirror in her bedroom, studying the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. 60 years old, with silver hair she kept pulled back in a practical bun, and lines around her eyes that spoke of too many seasons squinting into the Kansas sun. When had she become invisible? When had she decided that wanting something, someone, was a luxury she couldn't afford? The owl hooted softly from the kitchen, a sound that seemed to echo her own questions back to her. She'd always been good with wounded things, birds with broken wings, calves born too early, tomato plants struggling through drought. But she'd never learned how to tend to the broken places in herself. That evening, she walked to the edge of her property where the old fence line separated her land from the abandoned Morrison farm. The farmhouse there had been empty for 5 years, ever since old Claude Morrison died and his children moved to the city, unable to find a buyer for 200 acres of stubborn Kansas soil. But beyond the Morrison place, barely visible through the cottonwoods that lined the river, she could see lights in the windows of another farmhouse. Henry's place. She'd driven past it countless times over the decades, never slowing down, never allowing herself to wonder if he still lived there, or if he'd married, or if he ever thought about the girl who'd chosen someone else all those years ago. Her mother had written about him in present tense even in the later entries, as if he existed in some eternal summer where their love had never been tested by time or circumstance. Henry would understand about the way morning glories climb the fence posts, read one passage. He always saw beauty in the things that grew wild and untended. Elsie had kept the morning glories, even after Robert complained they made the property look unkempt. Every spring they returned, purple and pink blossoms that opened with the sunrise and closed by afternoon, brief and beautiful and utterly uncompromising in their wildness. She thought about the owl, how it had trusted her enough to let her tend its wounds even though every instinct must have told it to flee. Maybe courage wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about letting someone close enough to see you broken and believing they might help you heal anyway. Back in the house, she sat at the kitchen table with the journal open beside her and pulled out a sheet of writing paper from the drawer where she kept bills and grocery lists. The pen felt foreign in her hands. When was the last time she'd written anything longer than a check? "Dear Henry," she began, then stopped. What could she possibly say? That she'd found her mother's diary and learned they'd loved each other? That she understood now why Margaret had always seemed to be listening for something that never came? That she was tired of living like a ghost in her own life? The owl watched her with those unblinking eyes, head tilted as if waiting for her to find the words that would finally set them both free. The letter took her 6 attempts to write. Each time, she crumpled the paper and started over, searching for words that could bridge 4 decades of silence without sounding desperate or foolish. In the end, she kept it simple. "Henry, I found something that belonged to both of us. Would you like to see it?" She didn't sign her name. In a place where everyone knew everyone, he would recognize her handwriting, the careful script their third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had drilled into them with ruler-straight lines and patient correction. The owl's wing had healed enough to move without the splint, though the bird still couldn't fly. Elsie had fashioned a larger enclosure on the back porch using chicken wire and old fence posts, creating a space where the creature could stretch and exercise while remaining protected. Every morning she brought strips of chicken and fresh water, and every evening she sat in the old rocking chair Robert had abandoned, reading aloud from her mother's journal. The owl seemed to listen, head cocked at an angle that suggested deep attention. Sometimes Elsie imagined the bird understood the story of love deferred and chances missed, of women who learned to find sustenance in duty when their hearts were starving for something wilder. 3 days after she mailed the letter, Henry's truck turned into her driveway. She recognized him immediately, despite the 40 years that had carved new lines around his eyes and turned his hair the color of winter wheat. He moved with the same careful deliberation she remembered, as if he were always thinking 2 steps ahead, and when he knocked on her door, she felt like that 17-year-old girl who used to watch him from across the school cafeteria. "Elsie." His voice was deeper now, roughened by decades of calling cattle and shouting over tractor engines. "I got your letter." She led him to the kitchen where her mother's journal lay open on the table, the pages golden in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. He sat across from her, the same spot where Robert used to read the paper and complain about the coffee being too strong, and his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "I wondered," he said finally, "if she ever knew how much." "She knew." Elsie's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "She wrote about you until the very end. About the way you tipped your hat at the grain elevator, about your hands, about morning glories and wild things." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the soft rustling of the owl on the back porch. Henry looked older than his 62 years, weathered by sun and disappointment in the way of men who work the land and understand that not every season brings harvest. "I never married," he said quietly. "Came close a few times, but—" He gestured at the journal, as if it contained the explanation for every choice he'd never made. "I did marry." Elsie smoothed the tablecloth with nervous fingers. "For 18 years. But I could never stop thinking about what might have been different if we'd all made different choices. The owl called from the porch, a sound like longing made audible. Henry looked toward the sound with curiosity, and Elsie found herself telling him about the storm, the broken wing, the patient work of healing something wild enough to trust her with its vulnerability. "Can I see it?" he asked. They walked to the back porch together, and Henry stood very still as the great horned owl regarded him with those enormous amber eyes. The bird didn't seem frightened. If anything, it appeared to be evaluating him, taking his measure the way it might assess potential prey or predator. "Beautiful," Henry whispered. "How long before it can fly?" "Soon, I think. Maybe another week or two." The words caught in her throat because she realized she didn't want the owl to leave, didn't want to return to the silence of empty rooms and conversations with no one. Henry seemed to understand. "It's hard, isn't it? Learning to let go of something you've cared for." That evening, they sat on the front porch as the sun set behind the wheat fields, sharing stories of the years that had passed between them. Henry told her about the farm he'd inherited from his father, the struggles with drought and debt, the slow acceptance that some kinds of loneliness become so familiar they feel like home. Elsie spoke about her marriage, her mother's long illness, the way silence had become her primary companion. When he stood to leave, Henry paused at the edge of the porch. "Would you like to see my place? The morning glories you mentioned. I've got them too. They took over the whole south fence line." "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. 2 weeks later, on a morning when the air smelled of coming rain and new possibilities, Elsie opened the enclosure and watched the owl spread its wings for the first time since the storm. The bird perched on the fence post for several minutes, as if testing the memory of flight, then launched itself into the sky with powerful beats that carried it toward the river. Henry was there to see it, his hand warm and familiar in hers as they watched the owl disappear into the cottonwoods. Later, they would walk together to see his morning glories, purple and pink blossoms climbing wild and untended along the fence that had once separated their properties but now seemed like nothing more than an old suggestion, easily crossed by anyone brave enough to try. The journal remained open on Elsie's kitchen table, but she no longer needed to read her mother's words to understand them. Some stories end with letting go. Others begin there, with the recognition that it's never too late to choose flight over safety, to trust that wounded wings can heal strong enough to carry you home. If Elsie's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet strength found in second chances, or if it sparked hope in your own journey of healing, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to open doors we thought were locked forever. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that love can bloom even in the most weathered soil. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of what's waiting to be discovered.